I've been doing some calculations, and the odds are roughly 1 in 50 that this is National Library Week, that you're listening to this tape during National Library Week, and I want you to celebrate it. Go out to your neighborhood library and get yourself a dirty book from there. Get one of those get a classic one. Get yourself some D.H. Lawrence. You know D.H. Lawrence with all those loins and buttocks and all those things they didn't let you used to read about. Go get yourself a copy of D.H. Lawrence and sit down and read that. I would read this to you right now, but I'm afraid my voice is going to crack and then I'll blush and we'll have to retape this whole thing. Read it in your own privacy. Read it tonight when you're getting ready for bed. Read it and think about it, and something interesting might happen. Something interesting. You won't have just run up a flight of stairs, but maybe your heart's going to be beating faster. You won't have just exerted yourself metabolically in any sort of way, but you might be breathing faster. Who knows, maybe even certain outposts in your body are going to be weighing on your consciousness, yet you wouldn't have been stimulated there, and you will just have discovered the main point of today's lecture, which is sometimes all you have to do is think a thought and suddenly things in your body change all over the place. And that's real important in understanding how that happens more readily in some of us than others. This whole ability to think a thought, have an emotion, have a memory, and all sorts of things start functioning differently. We have the building blocks for understanding this by now. We know how one neuron works. We know how they communicate with each other. We know how those functions can change over time. We begin to see how large numbers of neurons can function in aggregates and networks. What we will do today is apply that knowledge, beginning to look at one particular aggregate of neurons, neurons that control this part of your body that we don't normally have a whole lot of control over. Voluntary function, the boring stuff where you can control your muscles, you think that you're going to move this hand, and yes, indeed, you do a second later. The voluntary nervous system, what we will hear about in this lecture, is the parts you don't normally have a whole lot of control over. The involuntary stuff, the blushing, the goose flesh, the orgasms, the pupillary contractions, the things you don't normally have lots of control over, the involuntary functions, the automatic functions, what's known, the subject today, what's known as the automatic, the autonomic nervous system. Okay, we'll be looking at that because that's the means by which your brain reaches out and potentially influences the functioning in every cell virtually in your body. And a real important theme for us is if that regulation goes wrong, the impact on disease is enormous. And in some of us, that regulation goes wrong. Where we start off with, looking in this diagram, is this contrast we're going to make. In blue, the boring, familiar stuff, this voluntary nervous system, and the characteristic of that is you've got neurons sitting way up in your cortex, what's called your motor cortex, and you decide to move a muscle, this nice schematic muscle here, and these are these long neurons, these axons coursing down your spine. In actuality, there may be a couple of neurons along the way, but schematically, this long projection coming out to your muscles, and you shake the person's hand. Very unexciting stuff. In contrast, we've got the autonomic nervous system, and it's centered in a very different part of the brain, a region that's called subcortical, below the cortex, and a particular region that's going to dominate the next few lectures, a region called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the center for all of this automatic stuff in your body. Hypothalamus regulates your heart rate, your breathing rate, whether you're sweating or not, whether you're having goose flesh, all those things. Hypothalamus sitting there, sending these autonomic projections down throughout your body to various organs, your heart, your kidney, actually, I'm not sure if this is an eyeball or a breast, but it works in either case. Your artfully hidden genitals there, all sorts of things of that sort. Target organs all over the place under the control of your autonomic nervous system. Very different flavors of the regulation. Voluntary nervous system, you think about moving a muscle, quarter second later you've moved it. This is the business about you need to coordinate your muscles instantly to run away from the lion. It's fast stuff. It involves regulation of your skeletal muscles. In contrast, it's your autonomic nervous system that has that slow percolating sort of influences. It doesn't make all that big of a difference if you blush 2 seconds from now or 3.5 seconds from now. You don't have as rapid of regulation as with the voluntary system. Another contrast, not only a difference in speed, you also get a contrast in terms of what parts of your body are under regulation of it. Voluntary nervous system, simply your skeletal muscles. Autonomic nervous system, every single cell in your body. Your heart, your kidney, as we just saw, etc. In addition, your immune system, various outposts of immune defenses there, virtually every bit of skin in your body. You find sort of when you get goose flesh, literally, you have tiny little muscles underneath the hairs of your skin, and that's the autonomic nervous system sending projections, sending axons to every single spot on your body's surface there, giving you goose flesh. This is an enormously distributed system, voluntary, fast, boring regulation of muscles, involuntary, the slowly emerging regulation of every single outpost in your body. Now, this autonomic nervous system, this automatic, this involuntary nervous system comes in two different parts. And these are real essential for understanding the regulation of the system and when it goes wrong. Two different parts, and they have a very opposing flavor, a very yin-yang sort of feeling, this whole sense of them working in opposition. The first half, sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system releases the most famous hormone we know of, adrenaline. Adrenaline coming out of your adrenal gland. Adrenaline, also known to its friends as epinephrine. In general, adrenaline is the British term, epinephrine is the American term. At other outposts of the sympathetic nervous system, releasing closely related to adrenaline, noradrenaline, also known epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine coming out of your sympathetic nervous system, all over your body at various organs. Sympathetic is for emergency. Sympathetic is for arousal, vigilance, excitation, all of that. As it's always described, sympathetic nervous system subsumes the 4 F's of behavior: fear, flight, fright, and sex. Okay, so that's what the sympathetic does. That stupid joke is required to be taught to every medical student in this country almost by definition in their first quarter, so you've just gotten a lot of the advantages of first-year medical school. Now we know the sympathetic nervous system joke. Sympathetic, emergency, arousal, the lion leaps out from out of your clothes closet, chasing you around the bedroom, that sort of thing. It's the sympathetic nervous system you turn on. The other half does just the opposite. The other half is the parasympathetic nervous system. Calm vegetative function. You eat a big meal, you turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. You reach puberty and you're going through a growth spurt, you're turning on parasympathetic nervous system more of the time. You are sleeping, you take a nap, you turn on the parasympathetic, calm vegetative function. Sympathetic, arousal, emergency, parasympathetic, just the opposite. Think of one as the accelerator, the other as the gas, and you can imagine the wiring of the system is such that, just as with a car, you never want to accidentally hit the gas and the brake at the same time. You never want to hit both the autonomic components, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, at the same time. You remember in the last lecture that business about those collateral projections coming off of the axons to inhibit the neighbor. In general, if you stimulate the sympathetic neurons, they send collaterals to turn off the parasympathetic. Stimulate the parasympathetic, you turn off the sympathetic. You don't want to get the gas and the brake going simultaneously. So these two very different sorts of systems, sympathetic, arousal, the 4 F's, norepinephrine, epinephrine, parasympathetic, calm vegetative function. Its particular neurotransmitter and hormone is called acetylcholine. Not all that important for us. The main thing is the opposition. Okay, let's get a sense of flavor of how these systems work. Where the circumstances are, where they are regulated, what they do. Obvious first example, your heart. Your heart is under profound amounts of autonomic regulation. It has both projections from sympathetic neurons and parasympathetic neurons. Axons starting in your hypothalamus, coursing down your brain stem, your spinal cord, a synapse here or there, but basically a projection starting from the hypothalamus, heading down there in a sympathetic axon, eventually having its axon terminals and heart muscle, and a parasympathetic one as well. What do they do? Exactly opposite functions, and you can guess them already. The heart, bizarrely enough, is an organ that beats on its own. Take somebody's heart out and put it in a dish, and it's going to continue beating perfectly regularly. The heart has an intrinsic rhythmicity. It beats on its own, one of the mysteries of how muscles do this, but nevertheless, the heart's real great at this. All your brain does is tell your heart to speed up or slow down. And you can guess exactly which does which. Sympathetic speeds up your heart. Parasympathetic slows it down. The lion is chasing you. That's no time to relax and decrease your blood pressure and sit there and think about your vacation coming up. You arouse the system. Heart rate increases. Blood pressure increases, the force with which your heart is beating, and this is this amazing effect where essentially the more you push the heart muscle out with the force of the blood flow, the harder it pushes back. A really interesting effect that increases the force of stuff coursing through the system. Why do you want to increase your heart rate and your blood pressure during an emergency like that? It's perfectly logical. If you're going to get out of there and save your neck, your thigh muscles need some energy. Not next week, right now. Get them glucose, get them oxygen, deliver it as fast as possible, increase your blood flow to those critical muscles there, get them going. That's what this is good for. In addition, sympathetic nervous system increases your pulmonary tone. You're breathing faster, you're exchanging oxygen faster, get the nutrients there to those muscles that are going to save your neck. Sympathetic arousal. The flight or fright syndrome, the 4 F's of behavior, sympathetic is good for that. In contrast, exactly as you would expect, parasympathetic does the opposite. It slows down your heart rate, that sort of thing, and an awful lot of what we do when we try to relax, okay, get a hold of yourself here, try not to be nervous, take a nice deep breath, and what you're doing there is you're triggering a parasympathetic reflex with your intercostal muscles, the chest muscles here. A deep breath triggers a parasympathetic volley to your heart, slowing things down. Take some deep breaths. It's not that much of an emergency here. Sit down here. Increase your parasympathetic tone. Parasympathetic doing just the opposite of sympathetic. A second example, just to give them further flavor of how these two systems work in opposition. Your gut, your stomach, your intestines, your gastrointestinal tract. What do you want to be doing with them in an emergency? Back to our archetypal emergency, an emergency not, oh no, you're going to be audited sometime in 2 months and you've just opened up the letter, but an emergency that most mammals would make sense of. Again, you're running for your life and some lion's coming after you, intent on eating you, and the overall logic of your gastrointestinal tract at that point is, don't worry about breakfast. You're trying to avoid being somebody's lunch. Shut down the whole system there. If you're going to get any energy to power those thigh muscles, you're going to get it from your fat cells, from your liver. You do all of that in the next 3 seconds. Digestion takes hours. It doesn't come cheap. Fascinating fact, your digestive system diverts 1/3 of the calories on average. 1/3 of the calories you get from food just goes to powering your digestive tract. That's a really high overhead rate from the physiological standpoint because you've got to pay for stomach churning, hydrochloric acid, and mucus to protect your stomach walls from the hydrochloric acid, and your intestines peristalting, all this rhythmic contraction. None of that comes cheap. And the stuff works slowly. You're running for your life. Somebody's intent on eating you. Don't worry about breakfast. Shut down the whole gastrointestinal tract. And we all know the first step of this. You get a little bit stressed, a little bit nervous, say, speaking in public, and your mouth gets dry. You've stopped secreting saliva. The first step in shutting down that whole system. You stop secreting saliva, your stomach stops churning, you stop secreting acid, hydrochloric acid into your stomach, your small intestine stop contracting. All of this is driven by the sympathetic nervous system. Arousal, the 4 F's, emergency, you're running for your life, the lion's coming after you. As we just heard, your heart's beating like crazy, your blood pressure's increased. Don't worry about digestion right now. Shut down all of that. Sympathetic nervous system shuts down activity up and down your gastrointestinal tract. It does another thing as well, an interaction between the GI tract and your cardiovascular system. You're running for your life, you got better things to do than divert blood to your stomach. Your stomach isn't even going to be doing anything at this point. Stop the blood flow to your stomach. Sympathetic does that as well. Shut down blood flow to unessential organs and get them where they're needed. That's what sympathetic does. And as you would imagine, parasympathetic does exactly the opposite. You're not running for your life anymore, but instead you're at this all-you-can-eat banquet to celebrate it afterward. Everything's worked out fine. It's parasympathetic that's saying, yes, get that saliva running down your chin, get the stomach churning, get the peristalsis, get all that working right now, working in opposition. Sympathetic, turning off digestion, parasympathetic, stimulating it. Very interesting consequence. We all know that if you are stressed too often, if you spend too much of your time being chased by lions or people in the IRS, that sort of thing, one of the diseases we become more vulnerable to is an ulcer. a peptic ulcer, and all sorts of interesting insights in the last few years as to how that occurs. Probably the most exciting new finding there is there's a bacteria that some of us have in our stomachs, a recently discovered bacteria which is real good at blowing holes in the wall of our stomach. For complex reasons, it's more likely to do so during stress. Here's another reason why we are more likely to get an ulcer during stress. The reason I just gave you, that explanation, you're running for your life away from a lion, don't send blood to your stomach. Send it where it's really needed. You cut down blood flow to your stomach. So what if you're stressed, not by lions for 30 seconds, but by 30 years worth of mortgages? If you were chronically stressed, you're chronically not sending enough blood to that organ. It's getting ischemic, hypoxic, not enough energy getting there. And what begins to happen there is you begin to cause little necrotic, little rotting spots of tissue in your stomach. You're starting to form an ulcer. And when you combine that with those bacteria sitting there, that's a double whammy. You've got problems then. Where ulcers come from in that stress context is you're sitting there saying, okay, well, let's feed them later. Don't worry about energy and oxygen and glucose for the stomachs right now. We've got our hands full running away from these IRS agents. Don't worry about the stomach. Do it chronically, and you set yourself up for an ulcer. Okay, so we've got this opposition, a second system showing this, sympathetic and parasympathetic doing totally opposite things at your heart, at your circulatory system, at your gastrointestinal tract. Third example. And this is one that shows just how complicated this coordination between these two branches of the autonomic nervous system can be. How do penises work? This is a pressing question, far too rarely touched in our school system. How do penises work? This is a very interesting issue, not only because it's amazing physiology, but it turns out to be an important medical problem. Autonomic nervous system becomes rather important in terms of erectile function. Okay, here's how penises work. You're finally going to get something worthwhile out of this tape. Here's how it works. In order to have an erection, you have to turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. Penises come in all sorts of varieties. You've got erections that are driven by blood flow in certain species, other ones that are muscular in other species. It determines how readily you get an erection and how long they last for, and, you know, isn't nature marvelous? All of its variety. All of them, nevertheless, are driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. You've got to be calm and vegetative to get an erection. Great. Okay, so you've managed to be calm and vegetative, and you've turned on your parasympathetic nervous system, you have an erection, and there's this remote possibility that over the next few minutes you might be getting a little bit less calm and vegetative. Maybe your breathing rate's increasing a little bit, maybe your heart rate's increasing, maybe you're slowly turning on your sympathetic nervous system. And more time goes by and you get even less calm and vegetative, and you're breathing even faster and sweating, your heart rate and your toes are curling and all these sorts of interesting physiological reflexes. You're getting more and more sympathetic. Eventually what you're doing is all of your body is screamingly sympathetic in tone while you're desperately trying to hold on to parasympathetic tone, and there's one lone outpost there, and finally you can't take it anymore. You turn off the parasympathetic, turn on the sympathetic, and you ejaculate. Okay, so that's how erections work. What happens if, for example, you're under stress? You're under stress, arousal, vigilance, emergency, 4Fs, all of that. If you're stressed, you have trouble turning on the parasympathetic nervous system. You have trouble establishing parasympathetic tone. You can't get an erection. You have stress-induced impotency. Suppose you've got a second problem, though. Suppose that you've managed to establish parasympathetic tone, but then suddenly you think about, oh no, the federal budget is not balanced yet. You suddenly get anxious about that. You accelerate the transition from parasympathetic to sympathetic. You do that switch over too quickly. Premature ejaculation. Either you don't get the erection in the first place, or you accelerate that transition, and this is a problem that is incredibly common. In males, the estimates are, from some studies, 60% of the visits to doctors in this country by men complaining of reproductive dysfunction turn out not to have an organic basis. They are psychogenic in origin, they are stress-related. This is a spectacularly clear case of you think certain ways, you feel certain ways, and certain parts of your body are not working anymore. Really quite striking. Okay, here's another useful thing to come out of this lecture. How do you tell the difference between an organic case of impotency and a psychogenic one? Here you get somebody, some guy comes in complaining that he hasn't been able to have an erection during sex in the last 6 months, and this is becoming a concern. And naturally you wonder, is this psychogenic? Is this person undergoing a lot of stress these days? Or maybe he's got a pituitary tumor. Maybe there's something wrong with the spinal cord. Maybe there's some organic basis. How do you tell the difference? Very simple test, one that could be done, in the privacy of your own home, that sort of thing, unsupervised. Here's the test. You take advantage of the fact that primates, male primates, have a very strange autonomic reflex, which is when primates go into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep during dream stages, during REM sleep, male primates get erections. I haven't a clue why. I've talked to the world's penis experts. Nobody has a good explanation of this, but this is what happens. Male primates get REM sleep erections. Okay, so you've got this person, and he's not able to have an erection during sex, and you wonder what the problem is here. And what you do is take advantage of that reflex. You give the person this handy-dandy little penile pressure cuff thingy that he takes home that night, and just before he goes to sleep, he puts on the base of his penis and wires it up, and, satellite relays and 24-hour operators, and the next morning you got your answer, which is, if this guy hasn't been able to have an erection during sex in the last 6 months, but 1 minute into his first REM sleep stage, he's got a perfectly normal erection, he doesn't have a pituitary tumor, there's not an organic basis, this person has a case of stress-induced impotency, psychogenic impotency. That's how you tell the difference clinically. Do you still have the REM sleep erections? Actually, recently, I heard about a much better way of doing this, because when you think about this, you've got this electronic transducer pressure cuff thing, and, beeping and lights and wires and all, and you're so, convinced it's going to electrocute you during the night that in and of itself is a stressor. Here's what you do instead, a far more elegant way of testing this that I've recently been told about. You take some postage stamps and you lick them and you put them on the side of the patient's penis, and the next morning, if the postage stamps have been torn loose, he had a REM sleep erection during the night. Can you believe how elegant that is? 96 cents you can do a diagnostic test in your own home. I don't know if you'll get reimbursed with health insurance these days, but that's another issue entirely. This is very, very elegant stuff. Isn't science wonderful? Aha, the march of progress. Okay, so we've got this contrast here between an organic versus a psychogenic impotency having to do with how's the wiring working there. And the remarkable thing about that system is this choreography, this movement between the perfect timing of parasympathetic and sympathetic tone. Essentially, if males had to understand how this worked, none of us would be here. Very interesting aspects of this autonomic nervous system. Okay, so you look at that, and some general themes come out in terms of sympathetic being there for arousal and emergency in the 4 Fs, parasympathetic doing just the opposite. An interesting subtle point here, though. Insofar as the sympathetic nervous system mediates emergency arousal and preparing for this crisis, that sort of thing, some of the time it does so by activating one of your organs. Your heart, for example, the sympathetic nervous system speeding up the heart. But as we just saw, some of the time the way the sympathetic nervous system prepares you for an emergency and dealing with that is by decreasing the activity of an organ. The gastrointestinal tract, as we just saw. Important point here, just because on a global descriptive level, sympathetic nervous system is for arousal and emergency and kicking into gear, sometimes it does so by inhibiting certain organs. On a synaptic level, the sympathetic nervous system is not always serving an excitatory function. Sometimes it could be inhibitory. On the level that we heard about a number of lectures ago, it's not the case that sympathetic always increases the likelihood of an action potential, that parasympathetic always decreases the likelihood. In the heart, sympathetic is excitatory, parasympathetic is inhibitory. At your gut, it's just the opposite. Sometimes you could bring about a large global excitatory effect by inhibiting certain components of the system. And that's an important subtlety to incorporate there. Okay, what we look at now is how do you regulate the system? Hopefully you are impressed by now. This is a pretty important part of your body and you want it working well. How do you regulate autonomic function? How does your autonomic nervous system know when to kick into gear? And we see a first example. A first example, the simplest sort of regulation here, the regulation that goes on in the autonomic nervous system in you and I and your pet lizard. Very simple stuff that is common throughout the animal kingdom, the real basic nuts and bolts of this autonomic function. And here we see this scenario. This is a very, very simple one. Suppose, in this artfully drawn figure, suppose you've just been injured, this blood vessel has been cut, and blood is pouring out, as drawn very graphically here. Blood is pouring out, and you need to change your blood pressure now. You increase your heart rate in order to compensate for your blood loss. That's the regulatory step you want to take right now. Increase your heart rate and blood pressure to compensate for the blood loss. How do you do this? All you need is the southernmost portions of your brain and your spinal cord. You need a sensor, a blood pressure sensor there, which sends a relay to your spinal cord up to various outposts. There may be a synapse or two along the way in your brainstem and midbrain, but eventually getting to the hypothalamus, control center for your autonomic nervous system. And what are you going to do at that point? You turn on your sympathetic tone via this projection to your heart, and you're going to change cardiac function. The critical thing in that case is all of the wiring going on there is the same in us and primates and non-primate mammals and reptiles, and this is very basic sort of protein regulation there. All you need there is some sort of sensor of your physiological state, something telling you you're cold, you're hemorrhaging, you're starving, whatever. Send the signal to the hypothalamus, and it does the appropriate regulation. Let's get a little more parasympathetic, let's get a little more sympathetic. Whatever the solution is, it's a simple reflex loop there, merely incorporating that very simple relay, peripheral sensors up to your brain, loop around the hypothalamus, do another lap, head down your spine again, and regulate that organ. That's real simple stuff. That's very basic circuitry. That's sort of very straightforward bioengineering stuff. We now move to the next level of regulation, and we take advantage of a second area of the brain. We have here just now this very basic regulatory stuff, your hypothalamus, your midbrain, your brainstem, that does boring, uninteresting things like make you breathe every so often and keep your heart beating at a rate that it should. We move to the next layer just above it, and this is a real interesting part of the brain called the limbic system. Limbic system is mostly a mammalian invention. Limbic system is involved in all the good stuff, emotions, rage and lust and fear and envy and love and seasonal matings and all sorts of stuff like that. Lizards don't have a whole lot of limbic system. Lizards are not particularly well known for their emotional complexity in their personal lives. Lizards, reptiles, amphibians don't have a lot of limbic system. Mostly mammals do. No surprise, primates have an awful lot of the stuff. Hippocampus, which we heard about in a previous lecture, hippocampus is contained in the limbic system. A number of other structures that we will hear about in the final lecture that are real relevant to certain emotions, to aggression, things of that sort. Those are limbic structures as well. Sometimes autonomic function is regulated by the limbic system. And let's see an example of that here. What we see now is a very special case, and this is one where I've probably drawn this inaccurately, but this represents my artistic limits. We have here a human detecting a pheromone. A pheromone is an odorant released by another member of your species that carries information. And the limitation here is that humans, in fact, don't respond to pheromones a whole lot. We're not like dogs and cats and all sorts of species out there where pheromonal communication is incredible in those species. By the odor of another individual, you can tell their gender. You, if you happen to be a hamster, for example, you can tell the sex of another individual, their age, their health, if they're ovulating, if they're pregnant, if they have their testes, if they're intact, if they're a male, all sorts of things of that sort. You can smell if they're a relative, even if you've never met them before. These pheromones carry tremendous communicatory value. In humans, there are pheromones, but they don't do a whole lot in us. We respond to pheromones to a certain extent. There's a fascinating phenomenon, and one that was shown about 20 years ago that's pheromonally driven, where human females, i.e. women, will have their cycles synchronized if they live together. And this is something that people always notice in their first year of college, and this is something that is known amongst a zillion different species out there. Put two hamsters together in a cage, and a couple of weeks later, they will both be ovulating on the same day, their cycles synchronized. Hamsters have 4-day cycles, and within a few weeks, the two of them have synchronized. In humans, the same thing occurs statistically, and this is called the Wellesley effect. The Wellesley effect, named after Wellesley College, college, all women's college, where this was first discovered, women who were roommates over the course of their first year together begin to synchronize their cycles. And the really interesting thing is the rodent studies suggest that it's not just anyone who synchronizes to somebody else. It's not random. It's the socially dominant female that forces the other one to synchronize to her. And the studies suggest the same thing with the humans. It's women who are more extroverted, more socially initiating, by some rough measure, more socially dominant. Those are the ones that others synchronize their cycles to. And this was sufficiently well known. When I was in college, people would sit around in the dorm and brag about, when we roomed together this summer, I had her synchronized by August 1st. This is what you get when you hang out with biologists. They take pleasure in that sort of thing. But this sort of stuff, and what's most interesting is this is done with odors. It's done with these pheromones, constituents in the sweat of guinea pigs and of humans as well. Sweat where it's hormone-derived, steroid hormone-derived, and we'll see a little bit about how that works later. And the stuff gets in the air and it carries olfactory information. It's pheromonal. How do you prove it? You close the nose of a hamster. You brutally give it a nose cold, something like that, and these synchronizing effects don't work anymore. And similar studies in humans showing that it's an olfactory effect. So that's one route in which you can carry a lot of information between species. So we see here one of these examples, and in this case, let's just decide to make life easier rather than this looking like a profile of a human. This is actually a male wildebeest. This is a male wildebeest who is smelling the pheromones of another invasive male. This guy is a territorial male wildebeest, and some other wildebeest has come in and is squatting on his territory, and he does not like it one bit. How does he know the guy's there? Maybe he's seen him, but even more likely, he can smell him around. The guy has been scent marking on all of his trees, and how dare he, and scent marking in all of his favorite spots. He's smelling this guy there, senses the pheromones, which get transported to an olfactory processing part of the brain, which sends a projection to another part of the brain, and eventually it winds up in the hypothalamus. And your hypothalamus at that point nudges your sympathetic nervous system into gear. Down you go, down the spine, and this is a somewhat more accurate drawing in this case. It's probably a hypothalamic relay to a midbrain structure, down to just outside the spinal cord here, so a couple of synapses along the way, but the same end product. You speed up the heart. This guy is fed up, he's outraged, he's incensed, he's intimidated, whatever it is, he's got autonomic arousal. His sympathetic nervous system is preparing to do one of the 4 F's. He's in a tussle here. He's all in a tumult, and this was not done because he's hemorrhaging. He's not injured. He's not starving. All he's doing is smelling somebody in his neighborhood who he doesn't think should be there. So a second layer of autonomic regulation. Some of the time you regulate the system simply on the level of, okay, we've got a leak down by the kidneys there, we need to do something at the heart level, let's have a meeting about this, here's the blueprints, where are the switches on the system, just straightforward autonomic circuitry. Some of the time, by the time you get to mammals, emotions can do this as well. What we see now is the third level of regulation, and this is the kind that we specialize in as humans. In this one, we take advantage of basically this third layer of the brain, the one we've heard about already, the cortex. The cortex that does all this marvelous abstract stuff, cortex which does recognition of our grandmothers and thinks of philosophy, and cortex that does all of these sorts of things. Cortex, as you might expect, is overwhelmingly a human specialization. As we heard already, we've got more cortex than anybody else in the animal kingdom, a greater percentage of it, and we are more cortical than any other species. What do I mean by cortical? This point I've been bringing through over and over. You think a thought, you have an abstract thought, you have some cortical activation, because we've just defined that on a neuroanatomical level. You activate your cortex and the rest of the brain reacts, and thus the rest of your body. So we see a third level of regulation here showing that principle. In this case, we have, again, our hypothalamus, our limbic system, and our cortex, and we don't have a blood vessel that's severed. Nobody's bleeding, nobody's hypoglycemic, nobody's freezing, nothing on this level. We don't have anybody invading our territory. All we're thinking about is rainforests disappearing, or someone we know and love who hasn't lived forever, or the fact that there's children in refugee camps, or late Beethoven string quartets, or whatever it is that's doing. We're having an autonomic response, sheerly by thought. And what you wind up seeing are neurons sitting around the cortex, sending their axons coursing down to the hypothalamus, and suddenly, thanks to a thought, a depressing thought, a disturbing thought, a section of D.H. Lawrence, whatever, suddenly your heart's working differently. So we see these different types of regulation here, going from boring, pure autonomic regulation up to the level of think a thought, and suddenly your heart's working differently, and your skin is secreting sweat at a different speed, and everything functions differently. This is the range of autonomic regulation available to us. And in lots of ways, it's this last level that's the most interesting, because it's real human and real close to home and real distinctive of our humanity, this ability to think thoughts on a purely abstract level, and our body works differently. There's one very important, tragically prevalent disease which can only be understood in that context, and that's a depression. Major depression. I don't mean depression like something bad has happened and you and I feel sort of down for the next few days and we don't have a whole lot of energy and don't really feel like seeing our friends, that sort of thing. Major depression, a crippling psychiatric disorder. People can't work, they can't get out of bed, they lose contact with everyone. A totally, thoroughly destructive disease that amazingly hits 15–20% of us at some point or other in our lifetimes. As it's been said, depression is the common cold of psychopathology. About 15 or 20% of us will be medicated or hospitalized at some point in our life for a major depression. And this is a terrible disease, and this is one that's absolutely biological, and a theme that hopefully has come through over and over in these lectures. When you look at someone who's depressed, there's this tendency to sort of say, oh, come on, we all get depressed, and, you know, pull yourself out of it, stop indulging yourself. And again, as emphasized in the first lecture, we don't look at a diabetic and say, oh, come on, enough of this coddling yourself with this insulin business. Come on, just get a hold of yourself and look at the bright side. This is a real biological disorder. It's a particularly subtle one, though, because of what the regulation of it is about. When you look at the autonomic nervous system in a person with major depression, it looks as if they're running away from lions all the time. They constantly have a certain degree of arousal of their sympathetic nervous system. And this has suggested to a lot of theorists in the field that depression is, in effect, a disease of stress. And there's lots of reasons to think that chronic stress is a predisposing factor towards depression. Depressed individuals showing a lot of indices of stress. The usual picture one has of a major depressive is this is someone who's sitting there in their bed and they can't even have the energy to get out, and after all, you know, you think of them as some sort of invertebrate. This is not someone who's sitting there exhausted on the end of the bed with no energy. This is someone wired up in the middle of a major battle, all of it inside their head. Critical picture of this disease. And you look at their physiology and it shows you the same thing. Elevated sympathetic tone, increased levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the bloodstream, increased muscle tension, increased metabolic expenditure. This is someone chronically turning on the sympathetic nervous system. So think about this for a moment. Chronically turning on the sympathetic nervous system. That's what you would do if you're starving. That's what you would do if every day the lions are chasing you, yet all you're doing now is the same exact thing with thoughts. All you're doing now is thinking about sad, poignant, depressing things, and your hypothalamus is falling for it. Your hypothalamus considers this to be as real as if you're hemorrhaging out of one of your blood vessels. On a very concrete neuroanatomical level, what a depression is about is your cortex is spending way too much time thinking sad, depressing things and telling your hypothalamus about it and getting it to activate your sympathetic nervous system as a response. And as a result, let's come up with a stupidly simplistic solution to that disease. Back to this diagram, if the problem with depression is too much sad stuff going on here and telling everybody about it here, I know, let's go in and just cut this pathway here, disconnect the cortex from the rest of the brain, and there you go, no more depressions. That's ridiculous. There's no way that could possibly work. There's at least a credible set of studies out there suggesting that in some cases, yes, indeed, this does work. And this is called a cingulotomy, or a cingulum bundle cut. The cingulum bundle is this whole cable of axons heading south out of your cortex, and there's reasons to believe that in a subset of depressed individuals who are resistant to every antidepressant drug, Prozac and everything else in the pharmacy thrown at them in combinations and permutations, resistant to every type of therapy, to electroconvulsive therapy, everything else, and they're still in the back ward of their state hospital attempting suicide every 3 months or so. A cingulum bundle cut is often quite protective. A number of studies showing this, controversial in a certain number of ways, but some evidence nevertheless that this is protective. And the amazing thing is, I give you this idiotically simplistic explanation. Oh, this is because your cortex thinks too many sad things and whispers it into the ears of the hypothalamus. That's the best explanation we have at this point. On a very rudimentary level, some of our most human of emotions are things that start in the cortex for abstract reasons and get sent on south, and among other things, can regulate our autonomic nervous system. Important insight into that disease. Okay, one of the themes that dominated an entire lecture 2 lectures ago is the fact that the functioning between 2 synapses can change over time. That plasticity business that seems so important. You see plasticity in the autonomic nervous system as well, on a much larger scale. And we know all sorts of examples of it. On the simplest sort of level, you're exposed to something very frightening and you have a sympathetic response, your blood pressure goes up, that sort of thing. Get exposed to it a second time, a third time, a 40th time, and you're not having a response anymore. Your autonomic nervous system can habituate over time. And all sorts of studies showing this. One classic one looking at, I think it was Norwegian guys in parachuting school, where they monitored them. The first time they flung these guys out of an airplane, their sympathetic nervous system was ready to blow their ears out, and you came back 3 months later after they've done a zillion jumps, and these guys, 5 seconds before their jump, they're sitting there with the blood pressure of somebody who's in the middle of a deep sleep. And the second they jump, they turn on the system. The second it's over with, they turn it off. Ideal signal-to-noise ratio, the functioning of their sympathetic nervous system had changed over time, had habituated. That's one example. At the other extreme, you could sensitize your autonomic nervous system. What didn't used to elicit a response now does. You have some trauma, you get mugged somewhere, and now every time you walk by that block, you get sympathetic arousal. That condition, that response didn't used to be there. Another way in which you get plasticity in this autonomic nervous system is you can strengthen the connections there. And that's exactly the business we talked about a couple of lectures ago, strengthening synapses, things of that sort. How do they work in this case? Okay, you think a thought, an anxious thought, a worried thought, and your blood pressure goes up. You, just in passing, think another thought. You think about a great vacation you had, a relaxing time with a friend or whatever, your blood pressure goes down. We understand by now how this works. You're suffering from high blood pressure. In a certain style of treatment, someone will sit around and wire you up to a blood pressure machine and have you talk about certain things and think about certain things, and suddenly you've just said something or thought something and your blood pressure's gone down. And they said, wait a second, what were you just thinking about? And said, well, actually, this great vacation that my wife and I had recently, God, that was relaxing. Okay, think about that again. Person sits there and concentrates, and down goes their blood pressure. Do it again, do it again, do it a bunch of times, and you've just given that person a conscious tool for regulating what is normally this non-conscious aspect of their physiology. This is what biofeedback is. Biofeedback is the process of strengthening these regulatory steps that we're normally not particularly conscious of. And you do that effectively with somebody, and in some cases that works just as well as the drugs and with fewer side effects. That's a way to regulate these systems, making those particular cortical to hypothalamic projections stronger and more conscious. So where do individual differences come in? In a couple of different ways. One is looking at this general flow of autonomic regulation. Back to that first diagram, your autonomic nervous system is sending projections to all sorts of different organs. And it turns out all of those projections are not equally powerful, and we differ amongst us as to we have a particular kidney sensitivity to our parasympathetic nervous system, we have a particular gastrointestinal sensitivity to the sympathetic. That begins to explain why during periods of stress some of us get heartburn, some of us get gastrointestinal problems, some of us get blood pressure problems. We're differentially vulnerable in terms of which branches of the autonomic nervous system are turned on. Even more importantly, as an individual difference, we differ dramatically whether or not we even turn on the autonomic nervous system in different situations. You get gored by an elephant, and all of us are going to have a sympathetic response and increase our blood pressure. That's pretty for certain. You get stuck on a slow bank line, and some of us are going to become hypertensive, and some of us are going to stand there daydreaming. This amazing human attribute, whatever it is that would give you or me an ulcer, somebody else out there is going to pay to do recreationally as their favorite idea of a hobby. That level of individual difference, when you even turn on the sympathetic or the parasympathetic, is obviously central to a very important class of diseases for us, stress-related diseases. We are not going to succumb to anthrax or malaria or dengue fever. We're going to succumb, for the most part in Western societies, to stress-related disease. And some of us are far more vulnerable than others. Type A individuals who have a certain pattern of hostility, far more so for cardiovascular disease, certain patterns of depression, individuals who are subordinated in certain social settings, tremendous individual variation as to whether or not you even turn on the sympathetic. Lots of room for variability there. So that brings us to the end of this subject. What we need to look at next is how your hypothalamus, the same hypothalamus, regulates another big chunk of your body, how it does so by way of hormone release. So that's our next subject.